Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the ancient roots of Indian culture to decode the complex tiers of its philosophy. So, if you've ever wondered exactly how one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations structured its spiritual beliefs, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're going to be drawing on some absolutely fascinating research by Ashish from India in Pixels. He's meticulously mapped out how ancient texts like the Rigveda basically act as the foundational source code for Indian society. Let's just jump right in. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the Rigveda's forgotten supreme god. Second, we'll trace the evolution of Shiva and Vishnu. Third, we'll see exactly how society shaped those gods. And finally, we're going to break down the tiers of Indian philosophy. All right, Section 1, the Rigveda's forgotten supreme god. So when you picture the ultimate central deity of ancient India's foundational text, who actually comes to mind? Now, if you're like most of us and you're guessing modern, widely revered deities, Shiva, Vishnu, Ganesha, Ash's research is actually going to completely surprise you. Turns out, the Rigveda is overwhelmingly dedicated to Indra. Yeah, Indra. Back in the Rigvedic era, which was roughly 1500 BC, Indra wasn't just a god, he was literally the center of everything. But here's the really fascinating part about him. He was this highly exclusive, entirely desire-driven deity. He absolutely was not a god of passive meditation. He was all about action. Kings and warriors worshipped him for immense material wealth, absolute victory in war, and earthly success. So the Rigveda, at least in its core layers, isn't really about spiritual detachment at all. It's essentially a manual for achieving your deepest earthly ambitions, with Indra right there at the absolute center of that pursuit. And you know what fueled Indra? Something called Soma. What's incredible here is that Soma wasn't just some myth. It was a potent, caffeine-like botanical drink. Think of it almost like an ancient energy drink, or maybe like an Indian ayahuasca. Warriors would literally crush the stalks of this plant, down the drink, and then completely surrender to the fierce spirit of battle in Indra's name. It was raw, it was intense, and completely focused on conquering the physical world around them. Moving on to Section 2, the evolution of Shiva and Vishnu. Okay, so if Indra was the undisputed king of the Vedic universe, how did gods like Shiva rise to the top? Well, it was actually this massive process of cultural assimilation. It starts way back in the Indus Valley civilization with a figure known as Pashupati, who was kind of a proto-yogi figure surrounded by animals. Then, as Vedic culture emerged, this figure merged with a truly terrifying Rigvedic storm god named Rudra, often called the Howler. People were genuinely terrified of Rudra. They'd actually pray for him to stay far away from their rituals. But over centuries, as different cultures and tribes intermingled, this terrifying deity started to soften. He slowly evolved into Bholannath, that innocent, auspicious, and super accessible Shiva that we know today. And we see this exact same evolutionary phenomenon happening with Vishnu. Back in the Rigveda, Vishnu started out as just a minor deity. His title was literally Upendra, which basically translates to Indra's little brother. He was essentially just Indra's battlefield assistant. But over time, through some really powerful narratives and avatars like Vamana, who famously conquered the entire universe in just 3 steps, Vishnu stepped right out of Indra's shadow and became a primary pillar of modern devotion. This brings us to Section 3, how society shaped the gods. Now, these huge theological shifts didn't just happen by magic, right? The source code of India was literally moving across the map. If we track the west to east migration of the Vedic people, we see they started out in the northwest, in the Kuru region, right around 1500 BCE. Then they slowly migrated eastward towards Panchal, Videha, and eventually Magadha in modern-day Bihar. And as they moved, they didn't just conquer, they assimilated. They interacted with non-Aryan tribes who had entirely different practices, things like deep meditation and nature worship. So as society became way more diverse, urbanized, and economically complex, they desperately needed new deities to reflect this brand new melting pot reality. And that perfectly sets up the ultimate clash of ideologies, the elitist, non-negotiating nature of Indra, who Ashish hilariously compares to the South Bombay or South Delhi of gods. It just couldn't sustain a massive, diverse agricultural economy anymore. You couldn't just keep doing huge animal sacrifices. You needed a god for the masses. Enter Krishna. Krishna was deeply empathetic, he had mass appeal, and he was incredibly inclusive. He actually famously challenged Indra's strict authority by lifting the Govardhan mountain, specifically to protect common villagers from Indra's wrath. Krishna was a rule breaker for the rigid clans. He even started traditions like Holi, where all castes and tribes could mingle freely. The society demanded empathy, and the theology answered. All right, our final section, Section 4, Tiers of Indian Philosophy. So to really understand the operating system of Indian philosophy, we first have to look at a massive historical patch update, known as the Smarta tradition. Historically, different clans used to fight bitterly over whose god was supreme. We're talking destroying temples and literal battles over Shiva versus Vishnu. The Smarta tradition, which was consolidated by Adi Shankaracharya, was just an incredible innovation. It unified the worship of the 5 major deities, put an end to the infighting, and basically created that seamless, multi-deity worship that you see in most Indian homes today. With that kind of unity finally in place, Ashish organizes Indian philosophy into 2 main tiers. You can think of it as easy mode and hard mode. Tier 1, the easy mode, is what, honestly, 90% of people practice. It includes bhakti, or devotion, the massive epic stories of the Puranas like the Mahabharata, the Smarta tradition we just talked about, and karma yoga. It's highly accessible, it's got mass appeal, and it's mostly based on surrendering to a higher power. But Tier 2, the hard mode, requires a completely different level of intellectual bandwidth. It's meant for rigorous, logical debate, really deep epistemology, and intense study. Let's pull the curtain back on this hard mode for a second because it is absolutely mind-blowing. These schools are incredibly advanced. You've got Nyaya, which is all about strict logic and figuring out how we even know what is true. You've got Vaisheshayaka, which is just fascinating because they were literally theorizing about Paramanu, which is basically atomic structure and early quantum physics, thousands of years before modern science even existed. Then there's Samkhya, which analyzes the super complex interplay between Purusha, meaning pure consciousness, and Prakriti, the material world. And finally, Mimamsa, a deeply conservative, highly analytical breakdown of ancient Vedic rituals. This right here was the absolute pinnacle of ancient intellectual debate. But honestly, here's what you really need to take away from all of this. Despite all the shifting deities we've looked at, the geographical migrations, and the complex philosophical tiers, it all perfectly anchors back to this one singular, beautiful code written in the very first mandala of the Rigveda. Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Truth is one, the wise call it by many names. So whether it's Indra, Shiva, Vishnu, or the logical atoms of Vaisheshika, it is all just different user interfaces for the exact same underlying truth. So now that you've seen the incredible matrix of this ancient culture, how it seamlessly evolved from the fiercely ambitious Indra to the deeply inclusive Krishna, and built these massive philosophical systems to match literally every type of human mind, it leaves us with one pretty powerful question. How will you apply this profound structural knowledge to your own spiritual and intellectual journey? Which tier of this ancient operating system are you going to boot up today? Think about it, and we will see you in the next explainer.